There is a Democrat who is the governor of New Mexico by the name of Michelle Grisham. And she announced on Friday what she's referring to as a new public health order, a public health order. And you see, this is just like during COVID. Public health orders involve suspending the Bill of Rights. I don't know what that has to do with public health. She's banning carrying firearms entirely in Albuquerque. The order to remain in effect for 30 days. And it means that civilians, law-abiding American citizens, are banned from carrying firearms either openly or concealed, regardless of whether any individual gun owner has a permit to carry. The public health decree, the Daily Caller reports, applies to Albuquerque, the state's largest city, and Bernalillo County, according to the Santa Fe New Mexican. No person other than a law enforcement officer or licensed security officer shall possess a firearm, either openly or concealed. So you see that the state, the only people allowed to have a gun. Everybody else, no, not allowed. She's just making it up. She's suspending the Second Amendment entirely. Here's a question from a reporter on this over the weekend.
This order basically says, stop stalling out, and to your point, just arrest everyone. Well, I also have to have the ability, I can't arrest everyone. There are literally too many people to arrest.
It's just logistically so difficult.
Well, this would allow us,
If someone's got a concealed carry permit in Albuquerque walking down a public street, they're not going to get arrested.
I can make the point that maybe they should be. And this is the point. I'm willing to do anything and everything.
She wants to arrest concealed carry permit holders.
Within a shred of evidence-based effort.
I barely need any evidence. I will use any pretext to place my own citizens under arrest.
The purpose is to try to create a cooling off period while we figure out how we can better address public safety and gun violence.
We're just gonna temporarily suspend the Constitution so we can come together and come up with a solution to, quote, gun violence.
It should horrify every American and every New Mexican that so many young people and so many individuals with no training, with reckless criminal behaviors, are openly carrying firearms in our communities. I'm horrified.
Yeah, you're horrified. And so the trick is to only allow the criminals to carry firearms and then force other law-abiding citizens to turn over their Second Amendment rights.
No constitutional right, in my view, including my oath, is intended to be absolute.
Who does she sound like, by the way, when she says that? Who does she sound like? That's right, Joe Biden.
There are restrictions on free speech. There are restrictions on my freedoms. In this emergency, this 11-year-old and all these parents who have lost all these children, they deserve my attention to have the debate about whether or not in an emergency we can create a safer environment.
All right, for more on this, I want to bring in a gun expert. His name is Mark Smith. He's the host of the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel, and he's the author of the book, First They Came for the Gun Owners. Mark, good to have you back with us, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Vince.
They're saying it out loud now, Mark. It's time to suspend the Constitution. What do you think?
Well, obviously, this is absurd. This act by the governor is blatantly unconstitutional. Not only does it clearly violate the text of the Second Amendment that says you have the right to bear arms, which means you have the right to carry arms, it actually thumbs her nose at the United States Supreme Court's precedent of NYSERPA versus Bruin, which specifically, Vince, said unequivocally you have a right to carry a gun outside the home for all lawful purposes, including self-defense. She is basically saying, I don't care what the Second Amendment says, and I don't care what the Supreme Court says. The other thing that's interesting, Vince, is guess what? The New Mexico Constitution actually has a right to carry arms as well, and the New Mexican courts have upheld that. So she's probably also violating the state constitution of New Mexico, and she as the governor of New Mexico. So she's really hit the whole trifecta here.
She sure has. Mark, John Lott points out to me in a text message just now that, permit holders are among the most law-abiding citizens in the country, and she is targeting them. How about that?
Well, that's 100% true, that if you look at the data, and John Lott is excellent on this, I believe if you look at the data, you actually find that concealed carry permit holders are statistically more law-abiding than even police officers, believe it or not. The bottom line, though, is that exactly right now, during the founding of this country, there was a famous Italian criminologist named Cesare Beccaria. It was so important that both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two of our most important founders, talked about, wrote about, and loved. And the reason why this is important is Beccaria highly influenced the founding fathers in the following way. He wrote this highly influential tract that says that gun control helps the criminals more than the law-abiding, because armed citizens are much harder to attack than, of course, unarmed citizens. So the notion that armed citizens protect public safety and advance public safety goes all the way back to Cesar Beccaria before the American Revolution, before the Founding Fathers, and before the Second Amendment. So we've already had this constitutional debate, Vince, and
Yes.
It turns out that Americans have said we have a right to carry guns. It's in the Constitution for a reason,
Yes.
and the fact this governor wants to suspend it is absurd.
Right, and also the British were disarming American citizens, and one of the reasons we put it in the Second Amendment is because of that very thing. No more tyranny, no more government disarming us.
That's correct, 100%.
And so here you have a New Mexico governor who feels comfortable saying these things out loud. How did we get to the point where an elected official, very casually just announces that an entire amendment to the Constitution is being suspended?
Well, I think we got here in various ways. I think one of the big ways is if you look at this ongoing attack on the U.S. Supreme Court, there is an attempt by the left to delegitimize the Supreme Court as it's currently constituted, because they don't like a group of judges who are following the text of the Constitution, who are looking at the original meaning of the Constitution, and they're not just making it up as they go along. This has made a lot of people on the left very angry, and it's caused this massive attack on all the justices. So I think the more you try to delegitimize the Supreme Court and the original Constitution and the history of our great country, the more you do this, the more you allow, so-called oath holders or folks like the governor here to basically say, hey, I don't care because I view that stuff as illegitimate. I'm smarter than all of that. I'm smarter than American history. And I think that's all part of this sort of, process. And I don't think it comes out of nowhere. I think she feels that she can do this and get away with this. And of course, we saw some attempts to shut down gun stores, Vince, in COVID land, where they were trying to say, oh, it's a public health emergency, we can do stuff to guns. That ultimately failed because there were lawsuits, and basically the governors relented, concluding that gun stores are indeed an essential service because the Second Amendment is a fundamental right to all Americans.
I can't speak to the legal side of this, but I can't help but notice that she says something like this. She abuses her power. She violates her oath of office, and she's not currently doing time in a jail cell, right? Like you've got people who've been arrested and prosecuted for, quote, parading or disrupting a congressional proceeding, and then they serve decades in prison. The governor of New Mexico just announced she's going to trample constitutional rights, and she's still running around free.
Yeah, well, there's a long standing going back to before our country's founding, Vince, about how politicians, legislators have really a level of immunity to do what they think is right and not go to prison, because then basically every single politician would be getting charged every day. So the founding fathers did not want that to occur. They viewed the proper check on rogue politicians was, of course, to get voted out of office, among the other checks and balances out there. So from her point of view, as I see it, she's like, hey, I'm going to generate a lot of attention about this issue. I'm going to draw it upon myself and talk about these issues of quote-unquote gun violence, which, of course, is a propaganda term. There is no such thing as gun violence, right? There's people that use guns to commit violence.
Yes.
And, yeah, I think that's what this is all about. She's generated the attention. But, this stuff has a way of backfiring because, if you look at the Supreme Court precedents in favor of the right to keep and bear arms, Vince, you find that a lot of these cases come out of places that don't like guns: New York, Boston, Massachusetts, Chicago, D.C. So when you do things like this as an anti-gun politician, it has a way to boomerang and sometimes ultimately makes it worse for your anti-gun side.
That's for sure, especially in a place like New Mexico, where you have Americans who definitely do value their Second Amendment rights. Here's some gun owners in New Mexico over the weekend rallying in Albuquerque. They've got their guns with them, maintaining their Second Amendment rights, and they announced to the governor, we will not comply. Listen to this.
Crime is riddled, and all we want to do is protect our families, our friends, our communities. I've gone on 2 combat tours with the Marine Corps and fought on the front lines. I've done 11 trips as an independent contractor. She thinks she has the right to take away my freedom to protect my community. I don't think so. This will not stand. We will not comply.
Well, if that doesn't make your heart swell with pride, I don't know what will. So there you have New Mexicans giving the governor the double barrel and saying, yeah, no thanks.
Yeah, well, right now there's already at least 4 lawsuits have been filed in the last 48 hours against this New Mexico executive order, and I suspect there'll be more coming down the pike. So, yes, people are immediately realizing what's going on, and I think it speaks highly of the Second Amendment community that someone like this governor can do what she did on a Friday, and by the time you get to Monday, you have multiple lawsuits in court, in federal court, challenging her blatantly unconstitutional action. I don't know if that would have been the case 10 years ago, but I think the Second Amendment community has become very robust, very serious, and very credible, and can act with a level of speed that I'm not sure we would have seen in years past.
Right. And also, I think for the Second Amendment community, I think there's been some recognition of just how easily the government can encroach on all of our rights that we experienced during the pandemic. The COVID experience was eye-opening for so many. And I think what you're seeing happen is gun rights people are coming out and going, yeah, we're not letting that happen because we can see how quickly this goes south.
I think it goes beyond even gun rights, Vince. I think it goes back to Americans have now really understood that our government, at the end of the day, may not be able to protect us. They're not protecting us from, open borders in the South. They didn't protect us from COVID.
Right.
I mean, it came here. They did not protect us from the crime we're seeing on the streets in places like New York City and Chicago. So I think people read the paper. They're getting educated. They're saying, look,
yes,
we may support government, but the reality is even if government tries, they're often going to show up too late, which is why I like to say on my channel, The Four Boxes Diner, you are your own first responder. Even if the police work hard and try to get there in time, frankly, as the old saying goes, when seconds count, police are minutes away.
Right.
I think that is a truism. Even if you have great police officers, I think most police officers are great, but the reality is on the ground, they're just not going to get there in time. They're not going to be able to protect us. Americans have figured out that government, even if it's earnest, is not going to be able to protect us much of the time. And you got to take steps to protect yourself.
Right.
That's the only way to do it. Our founding fathers understood this, and they set up a system that helps protect that right to protect ourselves.
And Mark Smith, sometimes it's not even just that they're failing to protect us, is that they've actively accelerated the harm. So in COVID, there's plenty of evidence that the government actually funded the very lab where COVID seems to have come from. So that didn't really help us, did it? And then meanwhile, when it comes to violence in our cities and around our country, a lot of these Democrat politicians are actually making it worse by refusing to prosecute violent criminals and hold them accountable, thus encouraging the very crime that's causing so much damage to our communities. So it's unfortunate. It goes beyond even the ability to protect us. It seems like they're almost involved in harming us.
Well, certainly, if you look at how some of these, Democratic-run cities are looking, you do see inordinate number of violent crimes going on there. And a lot of these people had very long records and probably should already have been in prison and thus not walking our streets.
Yeah.
But the fact that they're out there on our streets tells us we all need, in my view, to be able to protect ourselves. And one of the best ways to protect yourself is, of course, with a firearm, which millions upon millions of Americans recognize and do every day.
All right, Mark Smith, before I let you go, I do want to ask, what is your favorite home defense gun? What would be your number one pick for somebody who, not for non-gun owners who want to, finally, decide to jump into this? What would you pick?
Well, if we're talking about non-gun owners, I recommend revolvers because the odds of them jamming in a time of stress is very limited. But that, there's some other people out there much better at recommending home defense weapons than I am.
Okay.
But for someone that's a real beginner, I think revolvers are a good way because they're very easy and they don't misfire and they don't generally jam.
Yeah,
so that's what I recommend.
Whatever you do, get familiar with it and get out there on the range and practice. But either way, Mark Smith, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today, sir.